Sports. I'm your host, Isaiah, and today we're going to talk about turbos. So, this is an episode that is great for first timers, especially if you have just purchased a StarQuest or any other turbocharged vehicle of that matter. So, let's dive in and start learning. Okay, so we're going to start basic. Okay, so the wasted exhaust that your car produces is actually redirected directly to a turbocharger. And by doing so, in aftermarket applications, they use T3 or T4 type of flanges. Now, when they say T3 and T4, this part is T3 and that part is T4. Now, the bolt pattern for T3 is pretty universal. Okay, so it's two inner bolts, pretty slim design, and very universal. Now, these have different ARs, which come in different sizes, from 48 to 80 something, depending on turbo and size, but that is T3. So if we look at T4, the bolt pattern's a lot wider, as you can see there. So if the turbo is a T4, it would be giant housing with giant face housing. So moving on, I want to explain to you guys the bolt pattern that I have on the manifolds that I provide, which gives you the option of both T3 on the inner and T4 on the outer. You can use either one if you're trying to make smaller power, something around the 500 horsepower area. You can easily use one of these turbos. This is a GT35R dual ball bearing turbocharger with anti-surge in the face. So, anti-surge, I highly recommend it. And what it is this is the propeller. This is the face housing. Okay, so let's say you're boosting, right? As soon as the throttle is closed, you have a blow-off valve. Usually the blow-off valve, if you get a Type S or a super sequential or something like that, the millimeter of the diaphragm is about 20 millimeter, 22 millimeter, which usually when you're up in the higher boost levels, 20 plus, give or take, is not enough air released. So the remaining air goes all the way back into the turbo. And if you do not have anti-surge, which are these holes all the way around, it could damage the wheel and make it go the opposite way of which it was designed to do. So destroying the wheel of an expensive turbo is definitely not something you want to do or play around with. Now, in the anti-surge application, when the air comes back, instead of hitting the wheel directly, it's diverted through these holes. And if you look at the housing, it goes all the way around. So anywhere that the air hits the blade on the reverse cycle, it'll pop right out of the front. So that keeps these turbos alive a lot longer. I actually got this turbo used many years ago. Had to be around 6 years ago, maybe more. And it's still chugging to this day. So next, I want to talk about internal and external wastegate. Let's start with internal. So this is an internal wastegate. This is the exhaust side, and it has a flap. So what this does is basically, when you're boosting, if it was a completely sealed system and it didn't divert any of the air from the turbocharger, you would get max boost. Whatever your engine's able to produce is what you will receive boost-wise from the turbo, okay? So to balance the boost levels, we all have wastegates, internal or external. Internal is just like this, inside of a housing. You won't even see it except the arm. And the arm goes to an arm with a diaphragm and a vacuum reference, okay? It's actually pulling the wastegate closed, so when you reach a certain level of boost, it lets loose and bleeds out the excess air through the exhaust. So this is a rough view of a internal wastegate, but that is pretty much how it works. And as you can see, it diverts through this channel and comes out the exhaust, okay? So now we're gonna talk about external wastegates, which is this one and this one. So what we have here today is, turn it this way, crashing manifolds here, definitely not a good idea, but anyway. All right, so what we have here is a 38 millimeter wastegate and a 44 millimeter wastegate. Now, one thing you'll notice immediately is the size of the holes. So when they reference millimeters of the wastegate, they're explaining the valve diameter. So if this valve is smaller and this valve is bigger, this one will release a lot more air from the turbocharger, which means you can get a lower PSI to start with. That based off of turbo, airflow, spring size, all of those goodies, and you get your low number. Now, if I had amazing flow just like this one here, and I tried to release all of the air on a smaller setup like this, because this is 38 millimeter, I would end up having a minimum of around 10 to 15 PSI. And then at that point, there's no way you can get any lower unless you go with a bigger wastegate like this one here. So if you're trying to go the other way, which is boosting it up, I like this one in particular because if you're using an electronic boost controller and you have a 7-pound spring, technically you can double it with a electronic boost controller, so 14 pounds technically. Now, in this situation where the wastegate is too small for the setup, it will actually give you a lot more. But let's say your intentions was to have a car that was 20 PSI minimum and the maximum was up in the 30s. You have this screw right here that adds pressure to the spring and compresses it to raise the boost, which basically means it'll be harder for the air to push this valve open with more spring pressure on top of the valve. So if you hook up no boost controller and you hook up the vacuum line here, when you start feeding in boost pressure into this line, is going to push the diaphragm up. If it pushes it up, it opens really easy. This is where you want to plummet for your lower boost pressures. But if you're trying to have the opposite effect, you plug it to the top. The top pushes down on the diaphragm to keep the wastegate closed. Now, of course, all of that definitely depends on flow design, turbo size, all of those interesting facts and figures. Now, internal and external, they all have diaphragms, but these diaphragms are obviously bigger, and then the common size for the internal wastegate is usually smaller, pretty much about the size of this, pretty much. But next thing we're going to jump onto is both of these, T3 and T4. So you'll notice if you have a turbo manifold, it would route slightly different. In order to fully utilize this setup, the turbo manifold would route accordingly. So let's just say this is number 1. Okay, so it would be 1 and 4 to one side, and then 2 and 3 to the other side. That is how to properly utilize, basically increases the spool time, okay? Depending on the firing order, 1, 3, 4, 2, or what have you, it's going to increase the spool time. Now, if you're a die-hard, time attack type of driver, this is the type of setup most likely you're going to go with. Okay. Reason being is because you can get up to a whole 1,000 RPM. Of course, that's based off of setup, size of turbo, so on and so forth, displacement, and all that other good stuff. Now, on this turbo that we have here is your average opening, okay? It's kind of what I like to call an all or nothing setup. Either you make the power through this hole or you don't. So that is the difference between V-band and your basic opening. Another trick for early spool time is ball bearing or not. Usually ball bearing turbos like this one here increases spool time. And this, of course, depends on application, but anywhere from 500 RPM to 1,000 RPM. So if you choose, because everything's an option, to run a V-band setup like that, plus the dual ball bearing turbo, you can definitely get spool time as early as maybe up to 1,000 to 1,200 RPM quicker than normal. Of course, again, that depends on setup and what you're doing. But I have a vehicle that is actually internally wastegated and gives you a little bit more reference than this rough piece here. So let's go take a look at it. Okay, so what we are looking at here is my 87 Conquest, and I upgraded the turbo, but it is still internally wastegated. So, as you see here, the diaphragm with the vacuum port, and the diaphragm is in the middle between the top port and the bottom port, so you can boost higher from the top port versus the bottom port. So if you look, the arm tension is going this way, and you want to make sure that when you're adjusting this for more boost, which that's 90% of the time, it has an adjustable arm so you can tighten it up. So you take it off of here, and righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, loosey goes down and boost, righty-tighty goes up and boost, and basically you pull the arm and slide it back onto this guy here, which controls our internal flap, and that will boost you up. Then, of course, there's always the electronic route, 3-port or 4-port, which we're not going to get into this episode, but you have those options there. So This is the internal wastegate. Also to note, this is a T3, T4 setup, this being T3, this area being a T4. This turbo is actually a 50 trim, so it's actually pretty small, which is great for spool time and great for just overall drivability and power. So that is internally wastegated. And these are the external wastegate, just for reference. So this one is 38 millimeter, and it has the nice option of the adjustable boost on top, and of course Visa vacuum. And this one is a 44 millimeter, and it's on a V-band clamp instead of a stationary bolt-up setup like the 38 millimeter, which is nice because if you wanted to, you could have a hood exit for your wastegate and run that during track time, and you could spin it around and have a recirculating, which is going into the exhaust of the turbo for daily driver. So that's actually a pretty nice unit in that respect. But when it comes to big boost and big horsepower, you're definitely going to have to change the spring. This does not have that trick option up top. So you take off the bolts all the way around. A lot of people use a C-clamp to kind of compress everything down so you can get the bolts back in. And they have spring ratios for these wastegates, all different kinds, and they're readily available at your local speed shop, so it's nothing special or unique to get. What about factory applications? So, which brings me to my 93 3000 GT VR4. Okay, so each manufacturer has their own hot side. Let's just say it like that. So, for instance, Volkswagen has their own, Mercedes has their own, so on and so forth. Newer models actually move towards V-band collectors, so it goes from the turbo manifold to a V-band that goes directly to the turbo. But in the 90s, we all had our individual hot sides given manufacturer. So, for instance, this one, as dirty as it is shaped like a triangle on both sides. One over there, one over here. But the turbochargers are branded and they are 100% Mitsubishi units. So that's actually pretty nice. So the turbos that this one uses is actually pretty small. And the reason for that is the horsepower goal they were trying to achieve and the torque goal they were trying to achieve. And I gotta say, they pretty much hit it nail on the head. They were aiming for like 280, 290. And with the combo achieved on this car, they actually achieve, and this is based off of this year, the actual newer versions are actually higher horsepower and torque. But this one is 305 with around about 300 foot-pounds of torque. And that's pretty impressive for the early 90s. So that's matted to all-wheel drive. But I digress. The main point of this one is that they utilize two tiny turbos at about 8 to 10 pounds apiece to achieve the goal that they had in mind, which they definitely did. At that point, they were able to kind of divulge into other items. But Kind of going off topic again, but these turbos are pretty much maxed out in their state that they're in. And they're maxed out from the factory pretty much. But they do have options, of course, bigger turbos, so on and so forth, and reusing the rear housing with subtle porting, so on and so forth. And with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed, and if this is the type of stuff you like to watch, definitely consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon. So until then, I'll see you guys next time, and remember, knowledge is power.